Appreciate you listening. Always weird to come back from a vacation for like one day. But here I am. And I got to tell you, that alarm clock seemed really early this morning. But there's so much news to talk about this morning. And one of the things that we spoke about earlier was Donald Trump's speech that he gave earlier in the week. This speech I thought was interesting. And Sam and I and Joan, we all talked about it. Because a lot of people, including a lot of conservatives, decried the president's speech. You know, what the heck did we just watch? And why didn't the president really say anything? And I didn't really understand why it is that there was so much criticism of Donald Trump for this speech. Number one, he totally trolled the media by saying, oh, yeah, you know what? I'm going to, giving indications, hints that he was going to talk about going into Venezuela. And then it ultimately turned out to be a table setting heading into 2026 and the midterm elections. And I thought the president did a great job. A lot of people said that he didn't, again, including a lot of Republicans. That's all fine and well and good. We can all agree to disagree. But what did people say about Donald Trump's speech? And I'm going somewhere with this. Joan, what did people say about Trump's speech? He was angry. He was yelling.
He was yelling, yes.
He was angry. He was squinting.
Divisive.
He was divisive. I mean, all that stuff. He was blaming Joe Biden. Do you know, Barack Obama blamed George Bush for like 8 years. Remember that? So,
yeah.
I understand what people are saying. We are just about a year in with Donald Trump. And so you've got to, at some point, stop blaming Joe Biden. And I would agree with that. However, Biden, they told him to keep blaming Donald Trump for like 4 years, which is exactly what he did. When you talk about Obama, he blamed George Bush for like 8 years. And so I don't think that Donald Trump, I think that the damage that Joe Biden did to our country is, frankly, irreversible.
Come on, man.
Donald Trump is doing everything that he can do to reverse it, though, especially when we talk about immigration. All that to say, Harry Enton and the mainstream media, boy, they really had to choke on a couple of stories this week. Number one, they really had to choke on the story from yesterday with the inflation numbers that were lower than expected. We're going to talk about that with EJ Antoni coming up. But one of our faves, Harry Enton, excitedly talking about, oh, no, not the demise of Donald Trump and the Republicans. It was the demise of the Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, Democrats in the minds of the American public are lower than the Dead Sea. What are we talking about here? Well, let's take a look. The net approval rating for Democrats in Congress, you said it, Kate Baldwin, the lowest ever. Look at this. Overall, they are 55 points underwater. Their approval rating is south of 20%. It's even worse when you look at independents. Look at this. Negative 61 points. That means that their approval rating is 61 points lower than their disapproval rating. Quinnipiac has been polling this question for the better part of the 21st century. They have never found Democrats, at least those in Congress, in worse shape than they are right now.
One of the things that's out there today is that I guess, and I don't know, you see this, that the Democrats are not going to be releasing the results of their autopsy of the failure in the presidential election. You know, Joan, how they do this?
Yeah.
Where they go back and they look at what went right and essentially what went wrong. If you lost an election, they do an autopsy and they look and they figure out what happened. Well, they're not going to release the autopsy heading into or looking at the 2024 election. Now, we all know what happened. Joe Biden stuck around too long, and Kamala Harris was a disaster of a candidate. So a lot went wrong for the Democrats. I believe the reason why they're not going to release the autopsy is because it makes Kamala Harris look horrible. I think that's why, and she's thinking about running again, of course, in 2028. So I think there's a number of things that are going on right now with the Democrats. There's a number of things at play. The most important thing to note is that really low number among independents, down 61 points. Now, you all know that that is essentially where elections are won and lost with independents. Part of this, they say, is that the Democrats, they effectively lost the government shutdown battle. That is clear. They shut down the government so that the fraud in Medicaid could continue, so that illegal aliens could get health care benefits, and so that all of those people celebrating on Instagram and TikTok that they were getting freebies from the government, all those people that had the EBT cards, and you look at their grocery baskets and they've got all of this food, and all of this food is crappy, and they're celebrating that they're able to get all of this food for free, courtesy of the American people. That had, in my opinion, a negative impact on the Democrats, because they were the ones that were sticking up for the people that were fraudulently ripping off the government and the American people, in my opinion. Got the same damn thing with the Somalians going on right now in Minnesota. Don't even get me started on that. Because it's the Democrats that are allowing, Tim Walz, et cetera, the Somalians to rip off the government in Minnesota. It's the same thing. Every time you find the fraud, you see the Democrats ad nauseum. And I think that is now having an impact on the Democrat Party, especially when it comes to the independents. Wind and the rain last night, holy mackerel. Mine did not. My inflatables, for those people asking on the super text line, my inflatables are deflated this morning. So I hope yours at least were anchored to the ground. Wah, wah.
You sound so white.
I thought that my inflatables would be down the street and in the lake. But I walked out this morning. They were still anchored to the ground. They were, again, just deflated. Kind of like my mood this morning after 4 days off from work. But that's okay. I'm excited, though, because the Democrats are spiraling. What were we going to say, Sam?
I thought you intentionally structured your vacation that way.
Oh, no, there was no intention about it. They couldn't find anybody to fill in. Anyway, moving right along. So Brian Wilson coming up after the news at 9. More on the Democrats and how they are spiraling in the polls. And one of the things that I thought was interesting with Harry Enton, the discussion shifts as to how the party, the Democrat Party, sees itself.
Yeah, what about Democrats on Democrats? So part of the reason overall is so low is independents are driving it low. But that's not the only reason it's so low. What about Democrats on Democrats? Democrats' net approval rating of congressional Democrats. I want you to keep in mind, they had never rated Democrats negatively until this year. And right now, what are we talking about? We're talking about a net approval rating from Democrats. This is Democrats on Democrats. Their approval rating is actually lower than the disapproval rating, and that is quite the drop from October. I think during the shutdown, there was a bit of a boost for Democrats, right? There was a rallying around the flag effect going on. But Democrats did not like how that shutdown turned out. They have returned against Democrats in Congress. And you mentioned Dan Goldman in that intro. One of the reasons that Dan Goldman is in trouble right now in a potential primary against Brad Ladner is because at this point, the Democratic base is so upset with Democrats. So even if Democrats take back Congress, don't be surprised if Dan Goldman ain't there because of numbers like this one.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about from October to currently. In October, the Democrats, how they saw themselves up 22, currently -6. And you heard them talk about Dan Goldman. I have not so affectionately referred to Dan Goldman as like one of several, but he's one of the village idiots of the Democrats. He's by far one of the most vitriolic and vocal Democrats. He is out of New York. He's being primaried by a far more progressive candidate. And so I think the Democrats have a lot of battles going on internally. The progressives wanted to burn the government down, demanding those subsidies be extended. You remember that with Obamacare. We also know what happened. Some crossed over to the Republican side to get that continuing resolution passed. So that's part of what is going on within the Democrat Party. They couldn't agree on how to handle the government shutdown. But the trend is striking. Again, on the screen, you've got to go back to October. The Democrats were at plus 22. Now they're down 6. I mean, that is a huge fall. Also on the screen, you see that back in December of 2005 and 2017, when they were in Congress with a Republican president heading into the midterms, they had plus 10. Now that number is only plus 4. In other words, they're behind where they have been in the past under the same situation.
Look, Democrats are ahead, but they're only ahead by 4 points. Historically, that is quite weak. At this point in the 2017, 2018 cycle, it was more than double that at 10 points. The same back during George W. Bush's second term in office, where you saw, of course, the Democrats were also ahead by 10 points. So we're talking about a lead of less than half what we normally expect. And I think that's why, at this point, there are a lot of Democrats who might be thinking, hey, we can spike that ball in the end zone. But the numbers at this point say, hold on just a minute. Yes, you're on your way to a congressional majority, but it's still a long time. And with numbers like this, considerably weaker than historically speaking, it might be a tougher road to hoe. Democrats are hoping that Donald Trump's unpopularity can ride them to a congressional majority. But you know what? When you have numbers like this, hold the phone just a second.
Hold the phone. And, you know, I love how the Democrats are so into, Donald Trump's terrible, waning popularity. I have not seen the numbers lately on Trump, but I'd be willing to bet that, especially talking to Matthew Hurt earlier in the broadcast, where we were talking about how the Turning Point USA event in Arizona is going, I do believe that we've got a lot of good going on here within the Republican Party. I've got more because, you know, there were some numbers that came out yesterday that, I don't know, interesting. I heard some folks out there that are usually critics of Donald Trump, not a word on the president yesterday when it comes to the economy. We'll talk about that straight ahead. 722 on Nashville's Morning News. By the way, you can watch us on all the socials, Facebook, YouTube, 997WTN.com if you want to watch the radio show. Always appreciate that. Listen to us on the radio or on any of the streaming apps as well. Joan, I can always feel the love on the YouTube chat.
Yeah, okay.
Fly Crazy Girl says this in the YouTube chat. Mm-hmm. Hey, Sam, producer Sam, can you put E.J. Antoni's face over Dan's on the chat? He is so handsome.
Wow. By he, she means E.J. Antoni.
Yes, she wants E.J.'s face plastered over my face on the video.
I'm sorry,
on the video
Dan.
stream. E.J., thanks a lot. Could you, E.J., when you come on this show, you need to ugly yourself up, okay?
Yeah, I find this whole story very hard to believe that anyone would rather look at my mug, but whatever.
Well, I don't know. You're on Fox News, and I saw you yesterday talking about these great numbers, so let's get into it. Of course, lead economist for the Heritage Foundation, E.J. Antoni, back here on the program. So let's talk about these numbers, because I think that this is on the heels of President Trump's speech the other night, where he basically was setting the table heading into 2026 and talking about the economy, where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Very next day, we get these great numbers. I think this bodes well. But talk about the lower numbers, the CPI numbers and the inflation numbers. Talk about how these numbers did beat the expectations.
Well, the very short answer here is things are getting better. That's good news. We're moving in the right direction. But at the same time, we're not quite there, quote unquote, yet. In other words, we're making a lot of really good progress this year in getting incomes back up and getting them to grow faster than prices. Earnings growth is outpacing inflation. Really, really good news.
We call those real wages, right? Real wages?
Exactly. And you know what we saw under Biden was real wages falling about 4%. So yeah, your paycheck got a lot bigger, and that was great news for the average American. But what that larger paycheck could buy actually fell about 4%. Now, conversely, real weekly earnings, or what the average American's weekly paycheck can actually buy, that's risen about 1.6% under President Trump, and that's really good news, especially considering it hasn't even been a full year yet. But not only does that tell us things were moving in the wrong direction and are now moving in the right direction, but it also tells us we haven't yet regained all that lost ground. For those playing along at home, 4% is bigger than 1.6%. So we're still in the hole, if you want to think of it that way. That means that, again, although you're better off than you were in January of 2025, you're still not quite back to where you were in January of 2021. And I think that's why people are still really upset about the economy. That's why they're very disapproving, if you will, of their current financial situations. So yes, inflation is down. Prices are rising much slower than they were under Biden. And now incomes are growing faster than those inflation rates. So that's all good news. But again, we're not quite there yet, if you will.
One of the things I always say, EJ, and people who listen to the show know that I always say, doing better, not quite there yet. There's still work to do. So talk a little bit about what work is left to do heading into 2026. I know that a lot of the policies in the big, beautiful bill, some of the tax policies, the tax breaks and the tax brackets and so forth, that is all going to start up in 2026. Talk about the impact of that on the economy.
Well, I think what the administration really needs to do is basically double down on what has been successful so far. So what does that look like? Well, DOGE has done a great job cutting government spending. That has reduced the amount that the government needs to borrow. We've seen actually pretty amazing progress on the deficit. It's still way too large, don't get me wrong. We should get the deficit all the way down to zero and then start running a surplus so we can pay down the debt eventually. But for the time being, at least, they are shrinking the deficit pretty dramatically. So that, again, that's a step in the right direction. Double down on that. Really just go full throttle with DOGE, cut as much as you can from the federal budget that way until Congress finally gets their act together and starts making some real meaningful cuts and starts enshrining those things into statute. At the same time, keep going with the pro-energy agenda. We're already seeing the results of that. Look at gas prices. My goodness. They have been able to make incredible progress on energy prices, and that's because we went from an anti-energy agenda to a pro-energy agenda. So keep going with that as well. Also, keep going with enforcing immigration law. That has reduced the number of illegal aliens in the country. It has taken pressure off the labor market and allowed literally millions of Americans to get jobs again. The number of native-born Americans with jobs is about 2.6 million higher now than it was a year ago. Meanwhile, what's happened to the employment level for foreign-born workers? It's flatlined. In fact, it's actually down slightly over the last 12 months. So the labor market is increasingly becoming a place where Americans can get hired and can get hired in the private sector. The number of federal payrolls, in other words, government workers, the bureaucrats, that has declined. It's declined like a 250,000 this year. That's absolutely fabulous news. And again, we need to keep going on all of these fronts because so far, all of these things are working. Keep going and you'll keep producing the positive results.
EJ, a lot of people talk about Donald Trump and how he's been in office for a year, and so he shouldn't be going back and blaming, Joe Biden for the economy. And one of the things that I try to tell people is, yes, you talk about Donald Trump and how he's been doing from the day that he took the oath of office to how he's doing right now. But I also try to remind people, keep the perspective of what we went through with Joe Biden and the 9.1, 9.2% inflation, the really high prices and the high gasoline and so forth. I mean, that was a lot. And I don't know about you, but I've still got PTSD from Biden. And so part of what I try to tell people is think about how bad it could still be if Kamala Harris was the president. In other words, it takes some time to turn this ship around.
Well, it's exactly right. That's a beautiful articulation of what the problem is. Look, let's throw some numbers out there because I think that might help illustrate it. If you let's take like a typical American family. You got two adults working. Let's say they both have average incomes, right? They're getting what the equivalent of the average weekly paycheck in America. Under Biden, prices rose so much faster than their income did that it was the equivalent of losing more than $4,300 in annual income. So it's as if they saw a massive pay cut. Now, what has happened under Trump? Just like we were talking about earlier, incomes have risen so much faster than prices this year that it's as if that same family has seen an increase in their incomes of almost $1,700. Now, again, like we were saying before, that tells you two things. The first of which is we went from falling behind to making progress. But the second thing it tells you is that the $1,700 increase still has not made up for all of the $4,300 loss. You are still behind compared to January of 2021, coming up on 6 years ago when 5 years ago when Biden took office. And so you are still behind relative to about 5 years ago. That's why people still have that PTSD like you're talking about, because people still are not made whole, if you want to call it that.
One of the things, there's people that are still saddled with credit card debt because they had to put a lot of things on their credit cards. How big of a deal is it going to be if they end up lowering the interest rates?
It'll really, really help a lot of Americans dig out from the hole that they're in that you were just describing. I mean, racking up over $1 trillion in credit card debt in aggregate, that's a huge, huge problem. And we are still seeing, even to this day, people having to rely on these buy now, pay later schemes, which is really, really troubling to see for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is because it's difficult to get exact data on those kinds of things. But basically, if you're going to dig out of that hole, you need two things. Number one, you need incomes to be growing faster than prices, so you have that extra income to pay down the debt. Check. We can check that box. We have that. But the second thing that would really, really help is the lower interest rates that you're talking about, because let's say you have $100 a month extra to throw at your credit cards beyond like the minimum monthly payment. Well, if a large portion of the money going out is going just to pay the interest, then you're not going to make much progress paying down the principal. But you reduce that interest rate, especially if you can reduce it substantially, now your finance charges aren't that high. And much more of that same $100 can go to paying down the principal and reducing the amount you owe. And that's why we need real market interest rates to come down. But that's very different from the Fed's benchmark interest rate, what's called the Fed funds rate, moving up or down. What we saw, for example, about this time last year was the Fed reducing that benchmark interest rate, but real world interest rates didn't go down. They went up. The 30-year mortgage rate went up. The 10-year Treasury yield went up. So we need a new Fed chair, quite frankly, who understands that we don't just need the Fed's benchmark rate to come down. We need real-world interest rates to come down, and those are two very different things.
President Trump the other night talked about the Warrior dividend, $1,776 going to members of the military. There's also been talk about the American people at large getting tariff dividends as well. Is there a worry that inserting all of this money into the economy would actually cause inflation to go up?
Well, what you want to do is you always want to align these things with pro-work incentives. In other words, what we saw under Biden, when just literally anybody got a check, it didn't even matter if they were working or not. What does that do? Well, you basically created an incentive for not working, because I'm getting this check whether I work or not. And what did that do? Well, it increased consumer spending without causing any increase in the amount of products and services available in the economy on which people could actually spend that money. It was inflationary. You had more money chasing the same amount of products and services. In fact, in some cases, it incentivized people to not work or work less, and therefore there were even fewer products and services available. Conversely, if you do something like let's say a tax rebate or a tax reduction on payrolls, in other words, your payroll taxes go down, that is a pro-work incentive. That causes people to go out and work more, produce more products and services in the economy. You now have the same amount of money chasing more products and services. So in other words, in the first case, you actually put upward pressure on inflation, and in the second case, you would put downward pressure on inflation. We would much rather see the latter, those pro-work incentives in the economy, as opposed to something where we just hand out cash. We unleash the cash cannons again on everybody, whether they're working or not.
Big question in our final minute. All right, so tariffs, always going to be a big debate. The tariff haters have been saying that it was going to be disastrous for our economy, but I just haven't seen that yet. We've seen some jobs come back, and we've seen a lot of investment come into America. Where are you at right now on President Trump's tariffs?
I think the administration has done a really good job with tweaking the tariff strategy over time. For example, they're getting rid of the tariffs on things that there's just no way we can make them here, things like coffee, things like bananas, because those are cases where the costs are going to be passed on to consumers. And so they're getting rid of those tariffs, and they're really concentrating on the more strategic ways to implement tariffs, including things like steel, like computer chips, where there's a national security interest, or where there's a way to subsidize domestic industries and have them compete with their overseas counterparts. So as time has gone on, I think the tariff strategy has gotten better, and I'm hoping that that's going to continue in 2026.
EJ Antoni, as always, great to have you on, and we'll talk to you again soon. And just a wealth of knowledge. And again, appreciate you being with us. Have a great weekend.